Hi everybody, Kathy Syret from Confident Leader Journey here, and I want to continue with some thoughts on diversity, and in particular because it's Autism Awareness Month. Let's take a look at neurodiversity in the workplace. And I'm going to share some of the common mistakes that leaders make when they're interacting with neurodivergent employees. Okay. Now, in the last video, we talked a little bit about the value that neurodivergent employees can bring over and above the standard performance of a role. And the value of cognitive diversity was in the first video I did on the diversity series. So the ability to have people who think differently in your team, who look at things a different way, can't be underestimated. However, there are some assumptions that leaders make when they're working with teams, which can lead to the value of neurodivergence not being realized. And to fundamentally, it can end up with actually having practices in the organization that actively discriminate against neurodiverse people, which of course is something that none of us want as leaders. So let's just take a look at three key things that can get in the way of being an effective leader when we're considering neurodiversity in the workplace. Okay. Now, I've already said that these are based around assumptions. So the first assumption that will get leaders into challenging situations and cause difficulties for neurodiverse employees is the first assumption is that there is such a thing as common sense that is innate to people and that everyone has it. What we call common sense is actually a complex set of learned behaviors that we have developed from the beginning of our childhood into our teens and adulthood, where we have absorbed spoken and unspoken messages of what is and is not appropriate behavior. So it's common sense to do certain things. But when you dig into that, although we might say that, most of the time, what we think is common sense is actually something we have learned at some stage in our life. Now, this applies to everybody, not just people with neurodiversity or who are not neurodivergent. But if we assume that what we think is common sense is innately available to everybody, then when we see people not following that behavior or expectation, what are our assumptions going to be? Our assumptions might be they haven't got common sense or that they're deliberately choosing not to use it, when in fact, the learned behaviors are different. Now, just as a broad example, let's take eye contact and culture. I was talking to a fellow coach in the Philippines, from the Philippines the other day, and they said eye contact is considered rude. So they grow up, and common sense is if you want to sit down and have a serious talk with someone, or you want to coach them or help them in some way, you go and sit alongside them, and you both face forwards with occasional glances at each other. Now, in the UK, that would not be considered the norm. Here, common sense is if you're talking to someone and you're listening, you make eye contact. Because if you don't make eye contact, it means you're not listening. It's just common sense to make eye contact when people are talking to you. So there's a cultural issue there that shows that common sense is a learned behavior. Now, let's think about this other ways. If through your life experience, you haven't learned unconsciously or consciously about what social interactions are acceptable or not acceptable in the workplace, how are you supposed to know? A friend of mine took on a role as financial director and had some 18 and 19-year-olds come in for work experience and was complaining that they had no common sense. It was common sense not to stand around at the water cooler talking all day, not to spend all their time on breaks, not to play computer games at work. But when we actually sat them down and talked to them, none of them actually had experienced a workplace before. They didn't know what the expectations were. If you looked at the family environments, they had no opportunity to learn what the appropriate behavior was. So how could they be expected to know? So this issue of learned behavior is very important. So that's the first assumption. Don't assume that just because it's something you do or you know, that everybody else should know it. And in fact, there's a clue. As soon as you start hearing the word should, you should know this, you should do this, then you're probably using an assumption. Now, the other thing to be aware of, which is particularly relevant to neurodivergent people or people with neurodiversity, whatever phrasing you prefer, is the aspect of masking. What tends to happen is, because the wiring of the brain is slightly different in whatever form of neurodivergence you have, some things which are easily and unconsciously absorbed by people as they're growing up don't get absorbed by neurodivergent brains. The great example would be most of us learn fairly unconsciously how to read. We seem to pick it up, okay? And therefore we think that if someone can't read, there's a problem. Whereas if you actually are dyslexic and you can't see the words the same way, maybe the letters jump around on the page or they're blurry and it doesn't make sense, then you're not going to be able to learn to read in the same way. What this leads to, and it's similarly with if you keep getting told off for behaviours that are natural to you, and one thing a lot of neurodiverse people share is that they often have a feeling that everybody else has a rule book for how they're supposed to behave, but they don't. And what happens is, as someone with neurodivergence, quite often you have to consciously concentrate on working out what the rules are. Because what other people seem to have absorbed automatically by watching others and observing others, just somehow, if you're neurodivergent, you have to consciously learn. And then you have to consciously apply it. If you think about it, it's the difference between getting in your car every day and having to relearn consciously where the gear lever is, where the steering, where the mirrors are, consciously remember all the rules of the road while you're driving it, versus what can happen for many people is that after you drive the car a few times, it all goes into the automatic routines and we don't really have to think about it. Now, when neurodiverse people have to consciously focus on their social interactions and appropriate behaviours, or what is considered appropriate behaviours in the workplace, what they're actually doing is consciously managing their behaviour according to the rules that they are currently aware of. In order to do this, they are doing what's called masking. So masking is putting on a conscious act of behaviours in order to be effective in the workplace or effective in life and to fit in. Okay? The thing with this is it takes a tremendous amount of energy. So this masking, where we're consciously having to use learned behaviour all the time, means at the end of a workday, when everyone else is going out for a drink, I don't know about you, but I'm going home and I'm wiped out for the day because I've been putting my effort and energy into doing what's expected of me in the workplace, and I don't have the mental energy to do that anymore. I need to go away and recharge. Okay? So the level of exhaustion and tiredness that your neurodiverse employees will be experiencing will be way different from others. So we need to be aware of that. Now, here's the key thing about this. If common sense is a learned behaviour and masking is people consciously demonstrating and doing learned behaviours in order to fit in and be successful, that all leads to the third thing. And the third thing as a leader is we can't do it if we haven't learned it. Nobody can. It's a general rule for everybody. If you haven't learned how something is expected to be done or how you're supposed to do something, how could you do it that way? If you're lucky, you learn as you grow up. I mean, let's think about it. How many people do you think know how to change the wheel on a car if there's a flat tyre? Okay. Once upon a time, we thought that would be common sense and everybody would know how to do it. Nowadays, not so much. Is that their fault? Are the people who can't change a tyre stupid? Are they lazy? No. They have never had the opportunity or need to learn how to do it. So therefore, if it happens to them, they get a flat tyre, they don't know what to do other than call the recovery service. That's what they've learned to do. So as a leader, we need to be aware that whenever we have this thing about that was a mistake, or why didn't they use common sense, or Surely you should know that. Or you find yourself using judgment words like they're lazy, they don't pay attention to detail. I'm going to ask you a question. Did they know they were supposed to do that? Have you, as a leader, sat down with the person and actually checked that they understand what the role is, that they understand what the do's and don'ts are, that they know what the boundaries are? I mean, let's think about it. This is just good leadership, isn't it? But we get careless. We start assuming people know things. And if you think about some of the mistakes you've got into in your life, I can think about mine, they've often come because you've made assumptions. Assuming someone understood that when you said this needs to be carefully written, it means they need to spend lots of time on it when in fact you wanted it in 10 minutes. How are they supposed to know? So this thinking through, sitting down with your team, asking them what they think the task is, having clear outlines, having clear boundaries, agreeing these things in a collaborative process. This is how you get the best out of any employee. But it's a particular trap if you're working with people with neurodivergence, because you can get away with making assumptions when you're hiring people who are like yourself, because they will know what you mean when you use a catchphrase or a cultural reference or a colloquialism. But as we get more diverse in the workforce, whether it's cultural diversity or neurodiversity, we're going to have to become better leaders. We're going to have to step up. And we're going to have to work in a collaborative partnership with all our employees in order to get the most out of them from a business perspective, but also help them get the most out of themselves from a personal perspective. That's the essence of good leadership. Kathy Syrett from Confident Leader Journey here. I hope you found this useful. Subscribe to the YouTube channel or come and join us on the Facebook page, Confident Leader Journey. See you there.